To continue learning more about PHP, we want to get into just using it a lot. We want to see some of the more advanced things that it can do. We'll run into some more options of different ways to use PHP as we're doing this. Different functions that are available, some different types of loops, things like that. And in order to just have something to motivate all of this, we're going to look at form processing. So we've already done some form processing, basically form validating on the client side. But at the time we learned that, I cautioned that this is not the only place you should be doing it. You can validate your form on the client side using JavaScript, and you absolutely should, but this can be pretty easily circumvented. The person using the browser could have JavaScript disabled. They could simply not use a browser and just send the data directly to your server, in which case anything that would have run won't. So you always have to then again validate the data on the server when you receive it before you do anything with it. That's going to be our motivation for this particular section. The real goal is just to learn more about PHP, but you'll see something that's also very useful and very important if you're writing an application that has a form that submits new data of any kind. So, to begin with, sort of an outline of what we're going to go through. We're going to start by taking a look again at the HTTP protocol, or the HTT protocol, specifically focusing this time on the different methods that we can include in our request. These are usually called verbs, and these are actions that we give to the server to tell it what we want it to do. We're also going to delve a little bit more into the headers that are inside of these requests as well as the responses, and then the body. So these are all separate parts that contain different information. And in order to really know what we're doing at this point, as we distinguish between the client and the server, we've got to know a little bit more about how these are all structured. Then we're going to look at the two key methods or verbs that get used in form processing, get and post. And we'll see how those are all exposed inside of PHP. Lastly, we'll just look through some of the different methods that are available for validating things on the server side. This is much more ad hoc than it is when we do it in JavaScript, where JavaScript has some specific functionality built into it for form validation now. On the server side, we just sort of check it. We look at it, the data we've got, and make sure that it fits the patterns we want it to. And then we see what sort of response we're supposed to generate once we get all of this. So, let's peel back the sort of abstractions that are there in HTTP and look specifically at the verbs that are sent with our request. These are sort of commands that we're giving to the server, and we need to know which ones are available and which ones are most commonly used, and all of this becomes important now because there's really two options when we're sending a form. Previously, everything was always done with one option, and a file was sent back, or sometimes data if we were using AJAX. That basically meant that we didn't have to worry about this. But now we have two options, so it's time to go ahead and look into this. We'll look into all the options. Really, only two are going to move forward. So the most common one is get. That's what we've been doing up until now. This says, hey server, give me something. So we're asking for the server to give us something. We are not giving anything to the server, it's giving us stuff back. I say here this usually means we're asking for a static file, but not necessarily. We could be sending information to the server might then process that and generate something and send it back to us, which is what PHP does. So I wouldn't say that it's always a static file. Maybe, just a little more than 50% of the time, a static file is what's being sent back. Post is the other most commonly used request verb. This is when we're actually sending some data to the server, and we want it to add that data to some sort of resource that already exists on the server. The term post, I think, makes the most sense if you think about it like a Facebook or Twitter post or some sort of bulletin board post. We're giving it some data, and we want to post it into wherever the server stores that data, like we're creating a new post. This is something that's permanent on the server, that's added to the server, that other people in addition to you will see. Get is safe. You're always just getting something that already exists. Post is not. It sends data to the server and is asking the server, very nicely, to modify itself. And that could lead to malicious intent. So we always have to be a little more careful when we're dealing with post than when we're dealing with get. Get is always pretty darn straightforward. Now, there are some ones that still get used from time to time but are much more unusual than get and post. Put is very similar to post, but generally speaking, put is considered to be the polar opposite of get. And you're usually asking the server to create a whole new resource, not just add on to something that already exists. So it's not strictly the same as a post. Post could add to a thread in a bulletin board. It could add to your Facebook feed, something like that. But if you wanted to create a whole new, say, user account, the typical verb would actually be put, and then you would give it all the information for that brand new account. And it isn't necessarily going to go into the database somewhere. It's going to become something brand new. Patch is similar to that. It's probably the least used of the three P's. And patch basically says there's something that already exists, we're going to modify it, we're going to patch it up a little bit. So put, post, and patch are all very similar to one another. They all represent data changing on the server in some way, but all to slightly different degrees. Now the differences between these is a bit subjective. It becomes difficult to know exactly what belongs as a put versus a post. We're not really going to get into that. We'll never be doing anything other than post with what we're doing. So as you move forward and start doing more complex things, you might want to start trying to decide for yourself exactly what the difference is between put, post, and patch. But for us, post is what we'll be using. Delete is also one that, in my experiences, I've seen come up from time to time. This is when we're actually asking the server to remove something, some sort of resource that's there. The server still gets to decide whether it actually does this or not. It's still just a request. It's a command. It can decide whether to obey it or not. I have seen this in use in several places, and it can be a useful verb, but it's used much more rarely than get and post. The others rarely ever come up, except in really specific situations. Head is when you just want to get the header of a resource and you don't care about the body. We'll see what the difference is here in a moment. We already talked about patch. Trace is basically you're trying to trace things through the server. It's something that gets used by certain HTTP tracing programs. Rarely is it used by a client or a web browser. You just don't really see it. And options is a way to sort of interrogate the server and see what it actually supports. Again, not really used by browsers so much as used by more special purpose networking programs. So in web programming, we're probably not going to see those happening all that often. Now let's take a little bit deeper of a look at how this integrates with requests and responses. We've talked before about how the client generates requests, HTTP requests. But we've never really delved very deeply into what's in those. You can just think of them as files, text files, that have a certain structure to them. And here is what that structure sort of looks like. The very first line always has to be the request line, and it has a very specific structure. It first announces the verb. This could be get, post, delete, put, all those different ones we just looked at. There's also several others that we aren't bothering to look at here that are used even more rarely or have to do with specific protocols that are built on top of HTTP and not just generic HTTP itself. Then you identify the resource. This is always a URI, Universal Resource Indicator, that is somewhere on this particular host that it knows how to respond to. It might indicate a file. It might indicate just some sort of information that the server will use to generate a response. But typically it looks like a file folder sort of setup. You ought to be getting pretty used to seeing those. Previously they were called URLs, Universal Resource Locator, but they decided to change them to URI as a more generic term. Lastly, you indicate the specific version of the protocol, and this is nowadays almost always HTTP 1.1. Rarely are we seeing anything else in there. HTTP 2 is on its way. It's more or less finalized and standardized, and it will eventually come into use, but nobody's really using it yet, so that's not something you need to worry about at this point. That one line contains most of the critical information about the request. What follows are additional useful things that might need to be known that can change the sort of relationship of the response that will be generated, that can let the server know a little bit more about who it's talking to, but most of these things are optional. This is the header or headers, and they're always, like so many things that we've been dealing with, key value pairs. So you see here host is the key, and that's defined to www.test101.com, and that's something that identifies where I'm sending this to. That's something that the server itself probably doesn't need to know. It already knows who it is, but you get the idea. Some of the things that are in here, the server or client's telling the server, here's different types of files I can work with. Here's the language I'm expecting. Here's some encoding you could use if you want. These are compression things, so it could compress the body with these, and the client says, I will know how to expand those if you use them. It doesn't mean it has to, but it's letting it know. And if it compresses them, then it'll go a little faster. User agent here you can see is identified as Mozilla 4. That actually is identifying the browser that's being used. And then content length. This is the length of the body. Now, headers are fairly well standardized, but there are always a few rogue values that could get sent that it doesn't necessarily know how to interpret on the other end. That's okay. All of this together constitutes the full request message header. The request line must come first, and then sets of key value pairs after that follow the header format. Lastly, we need to have a full blank line. And that blank line is there to specifically delineate the end of the header. So that blank line is required. I always don't like languages or protocols that use white space to delineate things because it's something that's very easily leads to errors. But this one does, and there are several languages that do that as well. Python, CoffeeScript. You'll see they use tabs to indicate very important information that's normally indicated by curly braces. Nonetheless, that's part of the HTTP spec, and this really isn't meant for human consumption. It's meant to be used by computers, so we don't worry about it too much here. After the blank line, we have the body. A body isn't always necessary. And in fact, I have a little bit of a beef with this example. This is something I just sort of pulled off the internet. It includes a body along with a GET request. Now, you can always include a body if you want to, but it is weird to include one with a GET request. GET requests do not include their information down here like this. Normally, this information that they're encoding here, you can see a book ID and author, this would normally be part of the URI attached right onto it. We'll see how that works in just a bit. This actually looks a lot more like a POST request, and so I have a little bit of a beef with them calling it a GET request. I just want to tell you guys that so that you understand. But any request can have a body. Certain verbs, a body is not expected and has absolutely no meaning, and GET is one of them. Now, it just so happens that the exact same structure is used for a response. So let's take a look at a response. The first line is called the status line instead of the request line, and basically it identifies its protocol. It includes an HTTP status code, which we already know, and then a text that describes what that code is. You know what these can be. 200 is the one we want. That means okay. And then it will proceed to do whatever it's supposed to do. 404 would be I couldn't find what you wanted. 500 would be there was an error on the server somewhere. The header then continues, and lots of different things can be sent at that point. Typically, the most important one is going to be the content type, because that's going to identify what is to follow, namely what will be in the body. You then have a blank line, and then here comes the body. And you can see here the body, in this instance, is a HTML page. Normally this would have a lot more to it. They're just showing one little quick example here. This is obviously not a valid HTML page, but it is HTML. All the other information that's in here is not as important. The server identifies itself, but it doesn't necessarily have to. There's all kinds of different things in here to identify exactly what's going on. All of that stuff is optional, may or may not be sent. The most important thing is that if the response says 200, we generally expect it to respond with some content of some sort, a body. So this is what these things look like. Here's a request, here's a response. The headers and the status line or the request line, these are all generated by the browser, and we rarely see them unless we want to. You can dig into those and expose them if you'd like, and there are options inside of the developer tools to see all of these things, because when things go wrong, sometimes it's helpful to see what it's doing. But most of the time, we live our life happily never needing to look at these things. This really only becomes important once we start having to deal with processing things on the server side. PHP isn't going to require us to get too intimate with these things, but understanding the structure of them and the general idea is still very important. And as you become a more sophisticated web person, you might start getting into even understanding some of these header options that are available, and when it's important to take notice of some of the ones that are in there. So we're not going to delve into that too much. The key thing I want you to recognize is the status line at the top or the request line at the top. We're actually going to be doing things that affect this now, namely changing our verbs, and we've already been paying attention to the response code that comes in the response. The other thing you should pay attention to is that the header comes first, followed by a blank line, followed by the body. And the reason this is important is because as we're generating a response using PHP, once we've started to actually generate a body, there is no going back. You cannot go back and start to put things into the header. There is a point of no return at which the header is now closed. And that's just part of how PHP works. Some other languages do it a little differently and don't force that restriction, but PHP does. We may or may not get into that, but you will almost certainly get into it if you start doing some slightly more sophisticated PHP. And understanding this structure sort of tells you why. As it's outputting the header, once it closes the header out with that blank line, no more can be added to it. Everything else that gets sent is part of the body. Now, let's delve in a little bit deeper to the two most common things, get versus post. We're going to be examining both of these in detail, and I want to make sure that you understand sort of subtly what the difference is between them. This is important. So, get itself is a verb, it's a command. It says, give me something, and we're going to tell it what the something is we want. We identify that with the URL. The server when we send a get to it, it should not have a body to it. And the HTTP syntax specifically says that if a body is sent, it has no semantic meaning. Whatever's in the body is meaningless. And so consequently, you really should not be sending a body along with a GET request. Instead, you can sort of abuse a GET request. It's kind of abuse, kind of not. It all depends on what you do with it, by packing whatever would be in the body into the URL. This means that the URL gets kind of long and looks sort of weird, and I guarantee you've seen this before. At the end of the URL, you might see this kind of crazy stuff, a question mark followed by key equals value and key equals value, and so on and so forth. Many websites use this. This allows us to be more specific to the server, to tell it what we're looking for. But it should only be used to make the request, the something you're asking for, more specific. It should not be stored. We also have to do what's called URL encoding on this, and this is important because certain characters mean things in a URL. Spaces, for example, mean something, and slashes and periods mean something. And so if your keys or values contain those things, they would sort of mess up the entire URL. So you have to do what's called URL encoding and convert those characters into something that is able to be in a URL without messing it up. Now let's contrast this with the post verb. Post says, take this and add it. Add it onto, again, something. The something is usually, again, indicated by the URL, what you're trying to add it to. So you're adding a post to a thread. You're adding a status to your Facebook account, that sort of thing. You have to give it what you want it to add, and then you have to tell it where to add it. This must have a body. The data is always communicated in the body, and so the thing that you want it to add is in the body of the request. The general convention is that that will always be in key value pairs, and it is still URL encoded. Even though it wouldn't necessarily have to be anymore, it's just generally accepted that it should be. And the way you would identify that is by more details on the post request itself, the type it is, but you'll find browsers and PHP take care of that part for us. So as long as you're URL encoding and always specifying key value pairs of some sort, the rest is handled by the server software or the web browser. So the differences here are subtle. The verb itself, I think, is pretty obvious what you're doing. Get should basically just be getting something back, and data should not be sent along in the body. It has to be encoded in the URL. Post is giving it something, saying, here, do something with this. And so there should be data in the body, and both of them like to use URL encoding, which looks like this, key value pairs. Notice that the question mark's really only there when you're dealing with the get, because that's how it appends onto the end of the rest of the URL. It's not there when you do it a post because these key value pairs are in the body, and so you just start right in with your first key. Sort of a summary here. This is kind of like, what do you need to think about? Which one should I be using? We're going to be using these along with our forms. And so you have to sort of make a decision which one is most appropriate. Well, get is always going to use URL encoded data. It should be used to customize the response that's coming from the server, but that data should not be stored. Anytime you receive a GET request on the server, you should not store that data. That's not what the user intends, and that's not how that verb should be used. The data should simply be examined, the response may be tailored a little bit, and then sent right back. And that's it. No more of that data is kept around on the server. Post, on the other hand, encodes the data in the body instead of the URL. It should check that data, as always, we already mentioned, form verification, and then store it somewhere on the server. Maybe it modifies an existing part, maybe it goes into a database, that's very common. And then you can generate a response as well as appropriate that says, thank you, your data has been updated, or your account has been created, or here's some more info, or your bank account was just charged $1 million. Some sort of response that depends on the situation. So there is still a response body on both of these, a custom response for GET, and then a custom response on POST that usually says something about whether or not the data was actually accepted. Now, with all that said, we also need to know, how do I get to these in PHP? PHP does a lot of the work for us. It understands that form data being passed in via GET and POST is a very common thing. And so it just automatically grabs this data and makes it available in a couple of global variables. So for GET, all of the values that were inside of the URL are going to show up in an array that's called this. So $_GET, all capital. You can then access the individual values by passing a string into the array index. That might feel a little bit weird, but arrays can store integer values, or they can in fact store key values like this. That's also an option in JavaScript. We never had occasion to use it, but it's important here because our values come in named. Every key is a name. You pass that key into the array, you'll get back the value. Simple as that. You can use this anywhere. You don't just have to store it into a variable and use it, but that's a pretty common thing to do. Post, on the other hand, it automatically parses out all the values from the body instead of the URL, and it puts them in an array called, not surprisingly, _post. These are global arrays that are always available. Just like we did over here, you can pass in the key that you're looking for. It will give back whatever value it received. You might get back nothing. That means that that particular key was not defined. So keep all of that in mind. This is PHP doing the hard work for us. It's going through our URL. It is un-URL encoding it, and it is creating these arrays for us. That actually is fairly hard work. PHP just does it. Similarly, if it's a POST request, it looks at that body and it gets all the data out of it for you. The only thing you have to know is, was it a GET request or was it a POST request? Because you have to know which one to look into. And am I going to look into the GET array or the POST array? And now honestly, that gets pretty inconvenient if you're ever going to be using both, or if you ever want to examine both, or if you just don't care. You don't care if it came from GET or POST. Now you always should care, but I'm going to show you how to not care. Namely, there's another one. This array is called request, _request, and this contains basically all of the data that was in the request, whether it was in GET or POST or another one. So all of the values from GET and POST are in there. There's another one called cookies. You've probably heard of cookies. They're these very contentious things that have to do with data privacy, and we'll be seeing a little bit about those later on. All three of these are in the request array. These are all three different arrays. PHP takes care of all the details for you. If you really don't care whether it came from a GET request or a POST request and you just want to find it, request is what you should use. Whether they used GET or POST won't matter, you'll find the data. You might find some other data too that is in the form of cookies. But if it'll have a key and you just never touch those keys that are part of the cookies, it really won't get in the way. So, in the most generic case, this is your friend. It allows you to get to these things. Now, we just talked about why you should care whether it is a GET or a POST response, and in most cases, you'll know which one you're expecting. You'll look for that one. But as we're testing things now and just sort of seeing what kind of data comes to the form, we'll use request fairly often. It's a convenience.